In the year 390 BC, the city of Rome was burning. The senators' men who had ruled the known world sat perfectly still in their ivory chairs as the smoke rose around them. They did not run. They did not hide. Ancient Roman accounts describe them sitting in complete silence, robes arranged, hands folded, as if waiting for something they had always known was coming. The Gauls walked in and found them like statues. What happened next is recorded. What happened after to the one Roman official later held responsible for the collapse is not. His punishment was written down once, in a single document, and then the document was buried, not lost, buried. That detail has sat beneath centuries of scholarship, largely undisturbed, and most people have never heard it. Here is what we do know. Every major empire in the ancient world, Rome, Persia, Egypt, the Mongols, the Aztecs, the Ottomans, at some point in its history, invented exactly one punishment, so far beyond its own legal system that it was used once, and then quietly set aside, not abolished, not condemned, simply never repeated. No official explanation, no record of a debate, just silence where the record should be. Some of these punishments are whispered about in academic circles. A few have faded so completely from the historical record that the only evidence they happened at all is a single surviving papyrus, a damaged wall inscription, or a footnote in a document written 500 years after the fact by someone who may have had reasons to exaggerate or reasons to understate. What all of them share is this: the empire that invented each one never spoke of it again. Before we go further, if you have found your way to this channel and this kind of storytelling feels like home to you, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. Every week this channel goes deeper into the ancient world, into the forgotten corners of history that most documentaries leave untouched. The community here is quiet, curious, and genuinely passionate about the past. It would be good to have you in it. Now, 8 empires, 8 punishments, each one used a single time, each one leaving behind a question that has never been fully answered. We begin in Rome not with the burning, but with what came after, with a chamber built beneath the earth, a lamp left burning inside it, and a woman who was neither executed nor freed, but simply lowered into the ground and forgotten. In the heart of ancient Rome, there was a law so precise, so deliberately constructed, that it managed to kill a person without technically killing them at all. It was called the punishment of the living burial, and in over 1,000 years of Roman history, it was carried out fewer than 10 confirmed times. But the case that stands apart, the one that historians and archaeologists keep returning to, happened in the year 216 BC, in the shadow of one of Rome's greatest military disasters. Rome had just lost the Battle of Cannae. Hannibal and his Carthaginian forces had destroyed a Roman army of somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 men in a single afternoon. It remains to this day one of the most catastrophic single-day military defeats in recorded history. The city was in a state of grief that bordered on collective madness. People were looking for reasons, they were looking for signs, and they were looking for someone to blame. What they found were 2 Vestal virgins. The Vestals were among the most sacred figures in Roman religious life. They were selected as children, usually between the ages of 6 and 10, from noble families. They served for 30 years. They maintained the sacred flame of Vesta, a fire that Romans believed, with complete sincerity, was directly connected to the survival of the city itself. As long as the flame burned, Rome would endure. If the flame went out, catastrophe would follow, and the Vestals who tended that flame were required, above all other obligations, to remain chaste. A Vestal who broke that vow was not simply a criminal, in Roman eyes. She was a source of religious contamination. She had, in the Roman understanding of sacred law, invited disaster into the city. The defeats, the plagues, the fires, the floods, all of it could be traced, in Roman religious thinking, back to a broken vow. After Cannae, the Roman authorities identified 2 Vestals, Opimia and Floronia, as having violated their vows. The historical record, preserved primarily through the historian Livy, writing roughly 2 centuries after the events, describes what followed in careful and deliberate language. Floronia, according to Livy, took her own life before sentence could be carried out. Opimia did not. And this is where the punishment becomes something that sits in an uneasy space between law, religion, and something that has no clean category. Roman law had an absolute prohibition on the shedding of a Vestal's blood. She could not be strangled, she could not be beaten, she could not be executed in any of the ways Rome reserved for ordinary criminals. The law was not a formality, it was treated as a genuine sacred boundary, one that even the most ruthless Roman officials would not cross, because crossing it was believed to invite the very catastrophe they were trying to prevent. So Rome built a room. The site was called the Campus Celeratus, the Field of Wickedness, located near the Column Gate on the edge of the city. The room was constructed underground. It was, according to the ancient sources, furnished, a couch, a lamp, lit and burning, a small supply of food and water. Enough, the Romans told themselves, that the state had not condemned her to death. The earth had simply received her. What happened after the entrance was sealed was, officially, not Rome's concern. Opimia was led there in a sealed litter covered so that no one would see her face, because even looking at a condemned Vestal on her way to burial was considered a bad omen. She was guided down into the chamber. The lamp was burning. The food was there, and then the entrance was filled in above her. The Romans walked away. What is historically verifiable here is significant enough without any embellishment. Livy records the event. Plutarch references it. The Campus Celeratus as a location is attested in multiple ancient sources. In 1876, the archaeologist Rodolfo Lanciani, one of the foundational figures in Roman topography, whose work is still cited by researchers at the British School at Rome, documented what he believed to be remnants of underground chambers in the area, consistent with the ancient descriptions. One of those chambers, according to Lanciani's published report, still contained traces consistent with a small oil lamp. The report is real. The chamber is real. What it contained, and what it means, remains a matter of ongoing discussion. Archaeologists have noted that the construction of these chambers was not improvised. The underground rooms at the Campus Celeratus appear to have been built with care-fitted stone, not rough excavation. One theory suggests that the chambers were prepared in advance, sometimes before a trial had even concluded, which raises a question that the Roman sources do not answer. Were these punishments decided before the evidence was fully examined, or was the preparation simply a precaution that the Romans preferred not to discuss? What remains unexplained is the lamp. If the intent was execution, and regardless of the legal framing, the practical outcome was death, why light the lamp? The food and water can be explained as a legal fiction, a way of maintaining the pretense that Rome had not condemned the woman to die of thirst in a sealed room. But the lamp serves no survival function. A lamp burns for hours, not days. It would have gone out long before anyone inside that chamber could have used up the food. So what was it for? One theory suggests the lamp was theological rather than practical, a symbolic offering of light to accompany the woman into whatever space Rome believed she was entering. Not quite the underworld, not quite death, something the Romans themselves may not have had a word for. Another theory, advanced in more recent scholarship, suggests the lamp was for the benefit of the people sealing the chamber, a way of ensuring that the last image associated with the act was not darkness and abandonment, but a lit room, a furnished space, a version of the story that Rome could tell itself without feeling the full weight of what it had done. There is also this, in the entire recorded history of the Roman Vestal College, which spans roughly 1,000 years, fewer than 10 cases of this punishment are documented with any reliability. In a legal system that operated continuously for 10 centuries, that number is extraordinarily small. Rome had no shortage of capital punishment. It executed criminals, traitors, slaves, and foreign captives in enormous numbers. But this particular punishment, the one reserved for its most sacred figures, was used almost never. The question that historians continue to debate is whether that restraint reflects genuine reverence, or whether it reflects the fact that the punishment was so psychologically costly to the people carrying it out, that Rome preferred, when possible, to find another explanation for its disasters rather than repeat the process. After Cannae, the punishment of Opimia did not stop Hannibal. The war continued for another 14 years. Rome eventually won, but not through any visible act of divine restoration. The sacred flame kept burning, the city survived, and the Campus Celeratus returned to being an ordinary piece of ground, on the edge of a city that preferred not to think too carefully about what lay beneath it. There is a detail in Livy's account that tends to get lost in broader retellings. He notes that the Romans, after the burial of Opimia, performed a series of additional religious rites, sacrifices, consultations of the Sibylline books, the importation of foreign religious figures to perform ceremonies that Roman priests were not qualified to conduct. It reads, in the original Latin, less like a confident act of religious cleansing, and more like a community that was genuinely uncertain whether what it had done had helped or made things worse. The sacred flame burned on. Whether it burned a little differently after 216 BC is not something the historical record can tell us. What it can tell us is that Rome, a civilization that documented nearly everything, that produced legal commentaries and administrative records in staggering volume, left behind almost no official discussion of what the punishment of the living burial actually meant, or whether anyone believed it was just. The silence is not an accident. Silence in the ancient world is often the loudest part of the record. We are going to move now from Rome to an empire that may have invented a punishment it never actually carried out, and then used the story of that punishment to reshape the political geography of an entire continent. Persia, 401 BC. A method so precise in its cruelty that a single Greek writer described it in detail that modern forensic scientists have since confirmed is biologically accurate, and yet not one Persian source, not one inscription at Persepolis, not one clay tablet from the Achaemenid archives, has ever confirmed it happened at all. There is a punishment so precisely described in the ancient sources that modern medical researchers have spent serious academic time confirming whether it was physically possible. The conclusion they reached was that it was. Every detail held up under biological scrutiny. The progression of symptoms, the timeline, the cause of death, all of it checked out. And yet, in the entire surviving archive of the Persian Empire, one of the most thoroughly documented civilizations of the ancient world, with tens of thousands of clay tablets recovered from Persepolis alone, administrative records covering everything from ration allocations to royal correspondence, there is not a single line that mentions it. Not one. The punishment is called scaphism. The word comes from the Greek, meaning roughly the boats, and the only place it appears in the ancient record is in a single text, written by the Greek biographer Plutarch, approximately 500 years after the event he was describing was said to have taken place. That gap 5 centuries between the event and the only surviving written account of it is the first thing worth sitting with. Here is what Plutarch wrote in his life of the Persian king Artaxerxes II, describing the fate of a soldier named Mithridates, who had publicly claimed credit for killing the king's brother, Cyrus the Younger, at the Battle of Cannae in 401 BC. According to Plutarch, the Persian authorities took 2 wooden boats, or hollowed troughs, built to fit together. They placed Mithridates inside one, face up, with the other fitted over him like a lid, with holes cut for his head, his hands, and his feet, which were left protruding outside. They then fed him a mixture of milk and honey, forced it into him until he could take no more. They poured the same mixture over his exposed skin, his face, his hands, his feet. Then they set the boat adrift on a stagnant pond or marsh in full sunlight and left him there. They came back each day and fed him again. Every day, more milk and honey, more sun, more heat. Plutarch says Mithridates survived this way for 17 days before he died. The cause of death, according to the description, was not starvation. It was not thirst. What the milk and honey created, in combination with the heat and the standing water, was an environment of extraordinary biological productivity. Insects, larvae, decomposition of living tissue, progressing from the outside inward, while the man inside remained conscious, fed, and hydrated enough to stay alive through most of it. This is the detail that modern researchers focused on. In 2017, a forensic analysis conducted by researchers associated with the University of Maryland examined Plutarch's description against known biological timelines for insect activity, tissue decomposition in humid and warm conditions, and human survival thresholds. Their conclusion, published in academic literature, was that Plutarch's account is internally consistent. The 17-day timeline is plausible. The progression of symptoms matches what would be expected. The method, however deliberately it may have been constructed, works exactly as described, which makes the absence of any Persian confirmation of it more puzzling, not less. Archaeologists have noted that the Persepolis fortification tablets, a collection of roughly 30,000 administrative clay tablets recovered from Persepolis and studied extensively by scholars at the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, document Persian administrative and judicial practice in considerable detail, ration records, prisoner transfers, punishments for specific categories of offense. The tablets are mundane in the way that genuine administrative archives are mundane. They record the ordinary machinery of empire. Scaphism does not appear in them, nor does it appear in the Behistun inscription, Darius I's monumental carving on a cliff face in western Iran, which describes in explicit terms the punishments carried out against rebels: noses cut off, ears removed, eyes put out, men impaled and displayed at the gates of cities. Darius was not, by any reading of that inscription, a ruler who shied away from describing judicial violence. He catalogued it with what reads like institutional pride, and yet scaphism, if it was a Persian practice, left no trace in any Persian source. One theory suggests that Plutarch, writing in the 1st and 2nd century AD, was drawing on an intermediary source, possibly the historian Ctesias of Cnidus, a Greek physician who served at the Persian court and whose original writings have not survived. Ctesias had a reputation in the ancient world for exaggeration and sensationalism. Other ancient writers, including Plutarch himself in other contexts, noted that Ctesias could not always be trusted to distinguish between what he had witnessed and what made a better story. If Plutarch's account of scaphism traces back to Ctesias, it may be inheriting all of that source's unreliability, along with whatever kernel of fact Ctesias may have started with. What remains unexplained is why the story is so specific. Invented atrocities in the ancient world tend toward vagueness. They describe categories of horror rather than precise mechanisms. Scaphism is the opposite. It names the substance milk and honey, not simply food. It names the duration 17 days, not simply a long time. It describes the physical apparatus with enough specificity that modern researchers could reconstruct it and test its biological logic. That level of detail is either the signature of a real event transmitted through imperfect sources, or it is the signature of a very skilled fabricator who understood that specificity is what makes a story believable. Both possibilities are genuinely unsettling in different ways. There is a third possibility that some historians have begun to take more seriously in recent scholarship. It is the possibility that scaphism was invented deliberately as a political instrument not to be performed but to be described. The Persian Empire under Artaxerxes II was engaged in a continuous project of managing perception among its subject peoples and its enemies. The empire was vast. It could not be held by military force alone. It was held, in significant part, by reputation, by the belief, carefully maintained across generations, that Persian justice was absolute, that Persian punishment was without limit, and that defiance of Persian authority led to consequences that the human mind could barely accommodate. One theory suggests that scaphism was one of the empire's most effective tools, precisely because it never needed to be used. A punishment so elaborately horrible, described in enough clinical detail to be credible, spread through the Greek world, which was Persia's most persistent adversary, without requiring a single Persian official to actually build the boats. The fear was the instrument. The story did the work that the punishment itself never had to do. If that reading is correct, then scaphism is not simply one of history's most extreme punishments. It is one of history's earliest and most sophisticated examples of deliberate atrocity, propaganda, a story engineered for maximum psychological effect, released into circulation through intermediaries, and sustained by its own internal coherence for more than 2,000 years. What makes this theory difficult to simply accept and move on from is the fact that it requires the Persian court to have been operating with a level of strategic communication, sophistication that most popular histories of the ancient world do not credit them with, and yet the Persepolis tablets, the Behistun inscription, the administrative machinery of the Achaemenid Empire, as it is now understood by scholars at institutions, including the Oriental Institute and the Persepolis Fortification Archive Project. All of it suggests a bureaucratic and political intelligence of considerable refinement. These were not people who stumbled into managing the largest empire the world had yet seen. They thought carefully about how power was projected, how fear was distributed, and how stories travelled. Mithridates, if he existed, claimed credit for killing a Persian prince. In the world of Achaemenid court politics, that claim was not simply impolite. It was a direct challenge to the narrative of royal invincibility that the entire system of Persian authority rested on. The punishment for that kind of challenge needed to be remembered. It needed to travel. It needed to be the kind of story that Greek soldiers told each other around fires in Macedonia and Sparta and Athens for generations afterward. Whether or not the boats were ever built, the story did exactly that. It is still travelling. You are hearing it now, more than 2,400 years after the battle on the plains of Cunaxa, where a man named Mithridates either did or did not kill a prince, and either did or did not spend 17 days afloat on a Persian marsh while the world slowly dissolved around him. The historical record does not tell us which version is true. What it tells us is that somewhere in the space between a Greek writer with questionable sources, a Persian administration that left no confirmation, and a forensic report from a modern university that says the biology checks out there is a story that has outlasted the empire that may or may not have invented it. That is a particular kind of power, and it belongs, depending on which theory you follow, either to the cruelty of one ancient king or to the imagination of one very effective ancient storyteller. We move now from a punishment that may never have happened to one that definitely did, and whose physical evidence is still being excavated today. Egypt, the New Kingdom, a punishment that did not touch the body at all, but was considered, within its own cultural framework, to be far worse than death. The erasure of a name, the murder of a soul. And the one wall in Amarna where the workers stopped halfway through and never came back. Before we cross into Egypt, actually, pause for just a second. I am genuinely curious about something. This kind of history tends to find people at strange hours. Someone watching this at 2 a.m. in a city they have lived in their whole life, or someone halfway through an afternoon in a country I have probably never thought to imagine while writing this. Drop a comment below. Where in the world are you right now, and what time is it where you are? There is something about knowing that people are sitting with these ancient stories from places as far apart as the world allows that makes this whole thing feel exactly like what it should be. We move now from a punishment that may never have happened to one that definitely did, and whose physical evidence is still being excavated today. Egypt, the New Kingdom, a punishment that did not touch the body at all, but was considered, within its own cultural framework, to be far worse than death. The erasure of a name, the murder of a soul, and the one wall in Amarna where the workers stopped halfway through and never came back. There is a form of punishment so absolute that the people who invented it did not consider it an act of violence at all. They considered it an act of unmaking. In ancient Egypt, a person's name was not simply what other people called them. It was a living part of their identity, as real and as essential as their heart or their lungs. The Egyptians had a word for it, the Ren, and they believed with complete theological sincerity that as long as a person's name existed somewhere in the world, that person continued to exist in some meaningful sense. Their soul had an anchor. Their memory had weight. They could not be fully extinguished. To erase a name, then, was not to punish a person. It was to end them, not their body, which was already dead or would die in time regardless, but the part of them that was supposed to continue, the part that was supposed to be remembered, nourished by offerings, sustained by inscription, alive in the way that the ancient Egyptian understanding of eternity made possible. This was the punishment they called damnatio memoriae in later Roman usage. But Egypt had been practicing its own version of it for centuries, before Rome existed as a city, and nowhere in the entire archaeological record of the ancient world is the evidence of this punishment more physically present, more viscerally available to the modern eye than in the city of Amarna. Amarna was built by the pharaoh Akhenaten, the ruler who, sometime around 1350 BC, dismantled the entire religious infrastructure of Egypt, closed the temples of the traditional gods, redirected the wealth and attention of the empire toward the worship of a single solar deity called the Aten, and built a brand new capital city in the middle of the desert, on land that had never been settled before and has not been continuously inhabited since. Akhenaten ruled for roughly 17 years. When he died, The reaction was swift, thorough, and in its own way, as deliberate as anything he had built. The Egypt Exploration Society has been conducting excavations at Amarna since 1977. The work continues today, and what those excavations have revealed, layer by layer, is not simply a city that was abandoned, it is a city that was systematically erased. The name of Akhenaten was cut from walls, his face was gouged from reliefs, his image was removed from statues with tools, not broken removed, carefully, so that the stone beneath was clean and the surrounding decoration remained intact. This was not the work of an angry mob. This was organized. This was administered. Somebody drew up a list, assigned workers to specific sites, and oversaw a project of deliberate, methodical annihilation. Archaeologists have noted that the erasures at Amarna are not uniform. In some locations, the work is thorough to a degree that goes well beyond administrative necessity. There are walls where the carved stone has been cut so deeply in the removal of Akhenaten's name and image that the structural integrity of the surface was compromised. The workers went through the decorative layer entirely and into the backing stone beneath. That level of effort is not bureaucratic. It suggests something closer to rage, or to fear, or to both operating simultaneously in the people doing the cutting. And then there is the chamber. Among the ongoing excavations conducted by the Egypt Exploration Society and affiliated researchers, there is a location within the Amarna site where the erasure work appears to have stopped abruptly. The wall inscriptions on one side of the chamber are fully processed, names removed, faces obliterated. The surface is scraped clean in the systematic way that characterizes the broader erasure project. The opposite wall is untouched. The work simply ends at a point roughly halfway through what would have been a complete job. What remains unexplained is why. The standard administrative explanation that the workers finished the most visible or most important surfaces and considered the job complete does not fully account for the evidence, because the untouched wall contains inscriptions that are, by any reasonable assessment of their placement and content, at least as significant as the ones that were erased on the opposite side. They are not minor decorative elements. They are substantive texts. One theory suggests the workers were ordered to stop, possibly because the political situation in the royal court shifted during the erasure campaign in a way that made completing the project either unnecessary or dangerous. The period immediately following Akhenaten's death was one of considerable instability. The child pharaoh Tutankhamun was placed on the throne. His name was changed from the Aten referencing Tutankhaten, and the traditional priesthood was restored, but the transition was not smooth, and the people managing it were navigating competing interests with consequences they could not fully predict. Another theory, raised by researchers working with material from the Amarna period, suggests that the incomplete erasure was not an accident or an administrative decision, but a deliberate choice, a message left for someone who would know how to read it, a warning, or a marker, or a record of something that the people responsible did not want to fully disappear. This is speculative, but it is the kind of speculation that the physical evidence invites, because the incompleteness is too precise to feel accidental. The Turin Judicial Papyrus offers a different window into Egyptian erasure as punishment, and this one is anchored in a specific legal event rather than a broad political campaign. The papyrus, now held at the Museo Egizio in Turin, and studied extensively since its acquisition in the early 19th century, documents the trial of conspirators involved in what is known as the Harem conspiracy against Ramesses III, who ruled approximately 1180 BC. The conspiracy involved members of the royal household, palace officials, and at least one of the pharaoh's wives, who allegedly plotted to kill the king and place her son on the throne. What is remarkable about the Turin Judicial Papyrus is not simply what it records, but what it deliberately does not record. The names of the condemned, in several key passages, have been replaced with alternative names, insulting substitutions, names that translate roughly to things like Re is blind or evil in Thebes. The original names of the conspirators were not simply omitted. They were replaced with something designed to be a permanent mark of degradation, a name that carried its own punishment within it, that would follow the condemned person into whatever afterlife awaited them. This is a refinement of the erasure concept that goes beyond simply removing a name. It is the insertion of an anti-name, a label, engineered to cause ongoing harm in the spiritual framework that the condemned person themselves believed in. You could not take comfort in the thought that your name was simply gone and therefore neutral. Your name had been replaced with something that actively worked against you in the world of the dead. Archaeologists have noted that this practice appears in the Turin judicial papyrus and in related documents from the same period, with a specificity that suggests it was not improvised. Someone in the Egyptian legal or priestly administration had thought carefully about the theology of naming, understood its implications, and constructed a punishment that operated precisely within that theological framework. One theory suggests that the people who designed the name replacement practice were members of the traditional priesthood, the same institutional body that Akhenaten had attempted to dismantle a century earlier. If that reading is correct, then the refinement of erasure as punishment during the Ramesside period represents, in part, the priesthood reclaiming and weaponizing the very theological tools that a pharaoh had once tried to use against them. What remains unexplained is the emotional register of these erasures. Modern visitors to Amarna, and scholars who have spent careers studying these surfaces, consistently report something that is difficult to categorize. The physical evidence of the erasures, the tool marks, the depth of the cuts, the selective nature of what was removed and what was left, reads less like the execution of a legal sentence and more like something personal, something that the people doing it needed to do in a way that went beyond what any official order required. Ancient Egypt left behind an administrative record of extraordinary completeness in many respects. Temple accounts, legal proceedings, medical texts, agricultural surveys, the archive is vast, but the internal discussions, if any existed, about what it meant to erase a person's name, about whether the people carrying out these erasures felt the weight of what they were doing, about whether any official in any administration ever raised a question about the practice, those discussions, if they were ever written down, have not survived. The silence around the act of erasure is, in its own way, a kind of erasure. We leave Egypt now and move east and forward in time to an empire that approached punishment not as theology or as propaganda, but as a precise administrative science. China, under the Qing dynasty, a method of execution that was codified in law, given a formal name, regulated by imperial statute, and then, in one specific and deeply buried case, exceeded so far beyond its own regulations that the official responsible was himself put to death for it, and the record of that particular execution was removed from the imperial annals entirely. There is something almost paradoxical about a civilization that codifies cruelty, that writes it down, assigns it a name, gives it a legal framework, a prescribed number of steps, a set of regulations governing exactly how it should be performed, and by whom, and under what circumstances. A civilization that looks at its own capacity for extreme violence and says, we will not leave this to improvisation. We will make it a science. That is what the Qing dynasty did with Lingqi. The word is sometimes translated as slow slicing or death by 1,000 cuts, though the actual prescribed number of cuts in the Qing legal code varied considerably depending on the severity of the crime and the specific statute being applied. What did not vary was the underlying logic. The punishment was designed to be prolonged, to be witnessed, and to carry a specific message about the nature of the crime being punished. In the Qing legal framework, Lingqi was reserved for the most serious categories of offense: treason, parricide, the killing of a master by a servant, crimes that the dynasty considered not simply illegal but cosmologically disruptive, offences against the natural order that required a response proportionate to their gravity. The practice had roots going back through multiple Chinese dynasties, but it reached its most formally codified expression under the Qing, who ruled China from 1644 until 1912. During that period, Lingqi appears in imperial legal texts with the kind of administrative precision that characterizes Qing governance: broadly detailed, hierarchical, obsessively categorized. And then, in 1905, the Qing Empire abolished it. The abolition came under pressure from foreign powers, particularly in the context of China's engagement with international legal norms in the aftermath of the Boxer Rebellion and the subsequent treaty negotiations. The last officially recorded execution by Lingqi took place that same year, and it was photographed. The photographs exist. They are archived. They are real. A French missionary and photographer named Léon Bizy documented the execution of a man named Wang Weiqin in Beijing in 1905. Wang Weiqin had been convicted of murdering a Mongol prince. The photographs Busy took were later studied and written about extensively by the French philosopher Georges Bataille, who included them in his 1961 work examining the relationship between extreme suffering and what he called the experience of limits in human consciousness. Bataille's engagement with these images became one of the most cited and debated passages in 20th century French philosophy, a fact that raises its own set of questions about the relationship between historical documentation, intellectual inquiry, and the consumption of other people's suffering across cultural and temporal distance. But the Wang Weiqin execution, disturbing and historically significant as it is not the case that sits most uneasily in the Qing record. There is another case. It does not have a name attached to it in the surviving sources, which is itself part of what makes it significant. It appears, in fragmentary form, in the margins of Qing administrative correspondence, not in the main imperial annals, where one would expect a judicial proceeding of consequence to be documented, but in secondary records, the kind of bureaucratic paperwork that survives not because anyone preserved it deliberately, but because it was never important enough to destroy. What those fragments suggest is this. At some point during the Qing period, a magistrate overseeing an execution by Lingqi exceeded the prescribed legal parameters of the punishment so significantly that the Qing court took formal action against him afterward. He was, according to the fragmentary record, himself executed. Not removed from office, not demoted or exiled, executed. In a legal system where the executioner was a recognized professional, operating within a defined framework with specific technical training, this outcome is without parallel in the surviving Qing judicial record. The dynasty executed criminals. It executed rebels and traitors, and officials who had committed crimes against the state. But the execution of a magistrate specifically for the manner in which he had carried out a legally sanctioned punishment for going further than the law allowed appears in the available documentation exactly once. One theory suggests that what the magistrate did was not simply a technical excess, but a public one, that the execution was witnessed by enough people, possibly including foreign observers whose presence in Chinese cities was increasingly common in the late Qing period, that the court had no administrative option but to respond visibly. The execution of the magistrate, in this reading, was not primarily a punishment. It was a message, directed outward, at an international audience that the dynasty was increasingly aware of and increasingly anxious about. What remains unexplained is the removal of the record, the main Qing imperial annals, the Qing Shilu, or veritable records, a compilation of reign-by-reign imperial documentation that runs to tens of thousands of pages and is considered one of the most comprehensive administrative archives in human history, do not contain this case. A proceeding significant enough to result in the execution of a presiding magistrate, in a legal system that documented far more minor matters with considerable thoroughness, is absent from the official record. Archaeologists and historians working with Qing administrative documents, including researchers associated with the first historical archives of China in Beijing, which holds the largest collection of Qing dynasty official documents, have noted that the Qing Shilu, for all its comprehensiveness, shows evidence of selective editing during the compilation process. Certain categories of event were systematically underrepresented or omitted. Cases that reflected poorly on the dignity of the legal system itself appear to have been among them. One theory suggests that the case of the executed magistrate was removed not because the court wanted to hide the fact that a magistrate had been punished, but because the accurate documentation of what he had done would have required describing, in official imperial language, an act that the dynasty had determined could not be officially described. The removal was not of the punishment, but of the act that necessitated it, and removing the act required removing everything connected to it. This is a particular kind of administrative silence, not the silence of something that was never recorded, but the silence of something that was recorded, reviewed, and then deliberately unmade. It echoes, in a way that is probably not coincidental, the Egyptian practice of erasure that we examined in the previous chapter. Two civilizations, separated by geography and millennia, arriving at the same solution to the same problem. The thing that cannot be spoken of must be removed from the record, and the removal must itself be invisible, so that what remains is not a gap but a surface that reads as complete. The photographs of the Wang Weiqin execution complicate this picture in ways that the Qing court could not have anticipated. When Léon Bizet took those photographs in 1905, he was operating within a tradition of documentary photography that was still relatively young and whose implications for the long-term preservation of historical evidence were not yet fully understood by the people being photographed or by the officials overseeing the proceedings. The images survived. They travelled, they ended up in European archives, and eventually in the pages of a French philosophical text that circulated through the intellectual world of the mid-20th century and generated a body of critical literature that continues to grow. The Qing court abolished lingqi in the same year those photographs were taken. But the abolition did not erase the photographs, and the photographs did not erase the questions they raise. Bataille's central argument, in his engagement with the Wang Weiqin images, was that the human face in extremity reveals something about the nature of consciousness and experience that cannot be accessed any other way, and that the Western philosophical tradition's engagement with these images, the fact that French intellectuals found in a Chinese judicial execution a mirror for their own theoretical preoccupations, says something important about the relationship between cultures and the ways in which suffering travels across the boundaries that are supposed to contain it. What remains unexplained is whether Bataille was right, and what it means for the history of these punishments that the most enduring intellectual legacy of Qing dynasty lingqi is a work of French philosophy rather than a work of Chinese historical scholarship. The people who designed the punishment, the people who administered it, the people who witnessed it and lived within the society that produced it, their engagement with its meaning is largely lost. What survived, and what shaped how the modern world understands this chapter of Chinese judicial history, came from outside. There is a particular kind of historical irony in the fact that a punishment designed in part to be witnessed to carry its message through visibility, through the presence of an audience, through the social performance of state power, ended up being most thoroughly witnessed by people the Qing court would never have chosen as its audience. The record, even when it is incomplete, has a way of finding its witnesses. We move now from the administrative precision of the Qing to something that operates on an entirely different register. Not law, not theology, not political calculation, but what appears to have been a single moment of improvised fury that a man named Genghis Khan transformed, in the act of committing it, into one of the most consequential decisions in the history of human civilization. The Mongol Empire, the city of Otrar, molten silver, and the war that ended the world. In the year 1218, a caravan arrived at the city of Otrar. It was a merchant caravan, roughly 450 traders, according to the Persian historian Juvayni, travelling under the protection of a diplomatic passport issued by Genghis Khan himself. They carried goods, they carried correspondence, and they carried, implicitly, the assumption that the political agreement between the Mongol Empire and the Khwarezmian Empire, the vast Persian-speaking civilization that controlled Central Asia from the Caspian Sea to the borders of northern India, would protect them. The governor of Otrar was a man named Inalchuk, also recorded in some sources as Qadir Khan. He looked at the caravan, decided that the merchants were spies, and had them all killed. He then seized their goods. It is possible that Inalchuk genuinely believed the merchants were gathering intelligence. It is possible that he wanted their goods and needed a justification. It is possible that he acted on orders from the Khwarezmian Shah, Muhammad II, who may have had his own reasons for wanting the diplomatic relationship with the Mongols to collapse. The historical sources disagree on the motivation, and the disagreement has never been resolved. What is not in dispute is what Genghis Khan did next. He sent an embassy to the Khwarezmian court demanding that Inalchuk be handed over for punishment. The Shah's response was to execute the lead Mongol ambassador and send the others back with their beards shaved, a humiliation so deliberate and so precisely calculated to be unforgivable that it reads, across the distance of 8 centuries, less like a diplomatic miscalculation and more like a decision to end the world. The Mongol invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire that followed was among the most destructive military campaigns in human history. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, Nishapur, populations that contemporary sources estimated in the hundreds of thousands, were killed or dispersed. The demographic and cultural impact on Central Asia was so severe that some historians argue the region never fully recovered. The irrigation systems that had sustained agriculture across vast stretches of what is now Iran, Afghanistan, and Uzbekistan were destroyed so thoroughly that the landscape itself was permanently altered. All of this, by most historical accounts, began with a decision made by one man at a city gate in what is now southern Kazakhstan, and it ended, for Inalchuk personally, in a way that Juvayni recorded with a precision that is either the result of genuine historical knowledge or the result of a storyteller who understood that the ending of this particular story needed to match the scale of everything that came before it. When Otrar finally fell to the Mongol forces, after a siege of several months, Inalchuk was captured alive. Genghis Khan ordered that molten silver be poured into his eyes and his ears. The site of Otrar, located in what is now the South Kazakhstan region of modern Kazakhstan, has been the subject of ongoing archaeological excavation since the 1970s, conducted by Kazakh researchers including teams from the Institute of Archaeology in Almaty. The city's remains are real, the siege layers are real. The destruction strata that archaeologists have identified in the soil are consistent with the historical accounts of the Mongol assault. Juvayni himself wrote his account around 1260, roughly 4 decades after the events, and had access to Mongol court sources and Persian administrative records that no longer survive in their original form. His reliability as a historian is debated. He was writing under Mongol patronage, which creates obvious questions about his objectivity, but the broad outlines of the Otrar incident are corroborated by multiple independent sources, including Chinese, Armenian, and Arab chronicles of the period. The molten silver detail, however, appears in Juvayni and in a small number of related Persian sources, and nowhere else in the Mongol historical record. Archaeologists have noted that the Mongol Empire produced a significant body of administrative and legal documentation, including the Yasa, the legal code attributed to Genghis Khan, fragments of which survive in secondary sources. The Yasa is detailed on many categories of offense and punishment. It prescribes death for a range of violations, including the betrayal of a lord, the adultery of a wife, and the theft of horses. It does not prescribe molten silver for anything. One theory suggests that the punishment of Inalchuk was not drawn from any existing legal framework, but was invented in the moment, a punishment constructed specifically for this man, for this crime, in this context, and that the specific material chosen, silver, was not incidental. The merchants Inalchuk had killed were traders. Their cargo was goods, including silver. The wealth he had seized when he murdered them was, in part, silver. One theory suggests that Genghis Khan chose silver deliberately, that the punishment was designed as a literal enactment of what Inalchuk had done, a mirroring of the crime in the method of execution. The man who had killed for silver would be killed by silver. The substance of his greed would become the instrument of his ending. Whether this reading is correct, whether Genghis Khan was operating with that level of symbolic deliberateness, or whether the choice of silver was more practical, more spontaneous, or simply more available, is something the historical record cannot confirm. What the record can confirm is the consequence. The invasion that followed the Otrar massacre reshaped the political, demographic, and cultural geography of the entire Eurasian landmass. And somewhere in the chain of causation that connects a caravan at a city gate to the destruction of some of the greatest cities of the medieval Islamic world, there is this single act a man lowered or held in place, and a material that had travelled the Silk Road in the hands of merchants poured slowly into the openings of his face. What remains unexplained is the register in which Juvayni records this detail. He was a Persian historian writing under Mongol patronage, documenting a conquest that had destroyed his own civilization. His account of the Mongol campaigns is remarkable for its complexity. He is capable of genuine admiration for Mongol military genius and genuine grief for the cities that genius destroyed, sometimes within the same paragraph. But his account of Inalchuk's death is written without visible emotion in either direction. He does not dwell on it. He does not editorialize. He states it and moves on. That flatness is its own kind of statement. In a narrative that is elsewhere capable of considerable rhetorical range, the deliberate restraint around this particular detail suggests that Juvayni understood the punishment as something that existed outside the normal categories of historical judgment, something that the instruments of written commentary were not quite adequate to address. One theory suggests that the flatness was protective, that Juvayni, writing for a Mongol audience, was careful not to frame the punishment in any way that could be read as criticism of Genghis Khan's judgment. Another theory suggests the opposite, that the restraint was Juvayni's way of allowing the detail to land with its full weight, undiluted by any framing that might give a reader somewhere to stand other than directly in front of it. Both readings assume that Juvayni made a deliberate choice, and both are plausible, which means the ambiguity is probably intentional. The city of Otrar continued to exist after the Mongol conquest. It was rebuilt, resettled, and remained a functioning urban center on the Silk Road for several more centuries before its final abandonment. The archaeologists who have worked its layers have found evidence of the destruction and the reconstruction sitting on top of each other in the soil, the burn layer from the Mongol assault, and then, above it, the ordinary debris of people who came back and built their lives in the same place where something unforgettable had happened. People have a capacity for return that is at least as remarkable as any punishment ever devised to prevent it. Genghis Khan used the silver burial once. There is no record of it being ordered again, by him or by any of his successors, in the extensive documentation of Mongol judicial practice that survives. It remains in the entire archive of one of the most thoroughly violent empires in human history, a singular event used once at the beginning of a war that changed everything, and then set aside as if even the Mongols understood that some instruments, once used, should not be picked up again. We travel now from the steppes of Central Asia to the highlands of Mexico, and from a punishment invented for one man to a ceremony designed for thousands, a 4-day event at the heart of the Aztec capital that even the priests who conducted it appear to have found unbearable, and that no Aztec ruler, after the man who ordered it, ever attempted to repeat. In the year 1487, the city of Tenochtitlan did something that has no precise parallel in the recorded history of human civilization. It held a party. That is not a flippant description. The dedication ceremony for the expanded Templo Mayor, the great double pyramid at the heart of the Aztec capital, rebuilt and enlarged by the ruler Ahuitzotl to a scale that dwarfed everything that had preceded it, was accompanied by feasting, music, dancing, the distribution of gifts to the population, and the arrival of dignitaries from across Mesoamerica, including representatives of cities and peoples that were actively at war with the Aztec Triple Alliance. Enemies were invited. Enemies came. The ceremony was understood, even by those who opposed Aztec power, as an event of sufficient significance that political hostilities were suspended to allow attendance. And at the center of that ceremony, at the top of that pyramid, for 4 consecutive days, people were killed. The number is the first thing historians argue about, and the argument matters because the scale of what happened at Tenochtitlan in 1487 is central to understanding why the ceremony was never repeated. Contemporary Aztec sources, recorded in documents like the Codex Telleriano-Rimensis, suggest numbers that range from 4,000 to figures that some Spanish colonial-era sources pushed as high as 80,000 over the 4 days. Modern scholars regard the upper estimates with considerable skepticism. Logistical analysis of the physical space available at the Templo Mayor summit, combined with what is known about the mechanics of the ceremony, suggests that the higher numbers are not physically achievable in the time available. Estimates by researchers, including those associated with the Templo Mayor Museum and the Instituto Nacional de Antropología y Historia, or INAH, tend to cluster in a range of several thousand to perhaps 20,000, with the precise figure remaining genuinely uncertain. The uncertainty is itself significant. The fact that the historical record cannot establish whether 2,000 or 20,000 people died at the top of a single pyramid over 4 days is a statement about the scale of the event regardless of which end of the range is closer to the truth. The Templo Mayor Museum in Mexico City and the ongoing excavations of the Templo Mayor site that began under archaeologist Eduardo Matos Moctezuma in 1978 have produced physical evidence that gives the historical accounts a material anchor. Offering deposits beneath and around the pyramid contain human remains. Not in small numbers, the bone deposits recovered from what researchers catalogue as the various offering caches associated with the Templo Mayor include individuals whose geographic origins, determined through isotopic analysis, place them at distances of up to 2,000 kilometers from Tenochtitlan, Archaeologists have noted that this geographic dispersal of the remains is one of the most significant findings of the ongoing excavations. It suggests that the Aztec state was engaged in what can only be described as an empire-wide logistical operation to gather individuals for the dedication ceremony, not simply drawing on the population of the capital or its immediate surroundings, but collecting people from the outermost edges of its political reach and beyond. The ceremony was not local. It was continental in its procurement. One theory suggests that Ahuitzotl designed the ceremony with explicit political intent directed at the provinces and tributary states of the empire. The Aztec Triple Alliance maintained its control over an enormous and diverse subject population through a combination of military force, economic extraction, and the management of religious prestige. A ceremony of sufficient scale, one that visibly exceeded everything any previous ruler had achieved, that drew witnesses from across the known world, that demonstrated a capacity for organized violence on a scale that no rival could match, would function as a message to every subject people in the empire simultaneously. This was what their overlords were capable of. This was the scale on which Aztec power operated. Resistance, in the face of this, was a calculation that needed to be made very carefully. What remains unexplained is why it worked against itself. The political logic of overwhelming demonstration has a threshold beyond which it stops producing the intended effect and begins producing something else, not submission, but a kind of horrified recalibration, a reassessment not of whether resistance is possible, but of whether the entity demanding submission is something that can be negotiated with at all. Several post-conquest indigenous sources, recorded in the decades following the Spanish arrival and studied by historians including those working with the Florentine Codex, compiled by Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún, contain accounts suggesting that the scale of the 1487 ceremony was experienced within Aztec society itself as transgressive as an excess that went beyond what the religious and cosmological framework that justified human sacrifice was designed to accommodate. The Aztec practice of human sacrifice was embedded in a specific theological logic. The gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world and to keep the sun moving. Human sacrifice was reciprocal. It sustained the cosmic order by returning life force to the forces that maintained existence. It was, within its own framework, not simply violence, but a form of cosmic maintenance, a debt payment made in the only currency the universe accepted. But that framework had implicit limits. The debt was real but finite in any given transaction. What Ahuitzotl appears to have done in 1487 was expand the transaction so far beyond its normal parameters that even the priests operating within the framework found themselves in territory the theology had not mapped. The sources that describe priests refusing to continue after the second day, setting down their instruments and withdrawing from the summit, are not Spanish colonial inventions designed to retrospectively condemn Aztec practice. They appear in indigenous accounts, recorded by people working within the Aztec cultural tradition, describing the behavior of figures their own society regarded with reverence. The Tlamacazqui, the priest-physicians who conducted the ceremonies, were not squeamish people. They understood what they were doing within the theological context that gave it meaning. When some of them stopped, they were not making a humanitarian objection. They were making a theological one. The ceremony had exceeded the boundaries of what the framework sanctioned, and continuing beyond those boundaries was, in their understanding, not more piety but less an act that risked disrupting the very cosmic order it was supposed to maintain. One theory suggests that Ahuitzotl knew this, and proceeded anyway, that the political calculation of demonstration outweighed, in his assessment, the theological risk of excess. Another theory suggests that Ahuitzotl genuinely did not anticipate where the ceremony would end up by the time the fourth day arrived, that the accumulated momentum of 4 days of organized ritual on a scale never previously attempted carried the event beyond any point where it could be stopped, without itself becoming a disruption of cosmic order. Both theories leave the same residue. A ruler who had achieved something no one before him had achieved, and who found himself on the other side of it, in a position that his successors clearly decided they did not want to occupy. No Aztec ruler after Ahuitzotl attempted a ceremony of comparable scale. This is the detail that the historical record establishes most clearly, and it is the detail that raises the most questions. the empire did not collapse after 1487. It continued for another 34 years, reaching what many historians consider its maximum territorial extent under Ahuitzottl's successor, Moctezuma II. The resources existed, the military capacity existed, the theological framework that justified large-scale sacrifice continued to operate. There was no external constraint preventing a successor from attempting to match or exceed what Ahuitzotl had done, and yet none of them did. What remains unexplained is whether this restraint was theological, political, or something that operated in a register that the surviving sources do not have adequate language to describe a collective understanding, shared across the Aztec ruling class across 3 decades and multiple successions, that what had happened in 1487 was a boundary that should not be approached again. The offering deposits excavated at the Templo Mayor continue to be analysed. In 2015, INAR researchers catalogued a deposit designated Offering 141, whose contents included human remains arranged in positions that do not correspond cleanly to any known Aztec ritual pattern documented in the surviving sources. The individuals in the deposit were placed in orientations that the excavating team described as inconsistent with standard ceremonial practice. Archaeologists have noted that this deposit may represent a deviation from the prescribed ceremony, either an improvised addition, a response to something that happened during the ceremony that required an unplanned ritual response, or evidence of a practice that was not recorded in the sources that survived the Spanish conquest. What it means, precisely, is still being determined. The Templo Mayor itself was partially demolished by the Spanish after the conquest of Tenochtitlan in 1521, and the city of Mexico City was built directly on top of it. For nearly 4 centuries, the pyramid sat beneath the streets and buildings of a colonial and then a modern city, undisturbed in the way that things are undisturbed when the world above them has forgotten they exist. The excavations that began in 1978, triggered by a construction accident that exposed a massive carved stone disc depicting the dismembered moon goddess, Coyolxauhqui, have been ongoing for nearly 50 years. The pyramid is still giving up what it holds, slowly, layer by layer. In quantities and configurations that continue to produce findings the existing scholarship has not fully absorbed, Ahuitzotl died in 1502, approximately 15 years after the ceremony. The cause of his death is recorded in some sources as a head injury sustained during a flood that, according to those same sources, he had himself caused by engineering an aqueduct that brought too much water into the city. A ruler who exceeded every limit he encountered, in every direction, until the consequences caught up with him. We move now from the highlands of Mexico to the plains of Macedonia, and from a punishment of overwhelming scale to one of devastating precision. A single general, a single accusation, and the letters that Alexander the Great sent to a man he was about to have killed, whose contents were never recorded, and which no copy of has ever been found. In the autumn of the year 330 BC, the most powerful man in the world made a decision he could not take back. That is not a dramatic framing. It is simply what the historical record shows. Alexander the Great, at the age of 26, having conquered Persia, having marched his army from Macedonia to the edges of Central Asia, having accumulated a degree of personal power that had no precedent in the world he inhabited, ordered the execution of his most senior general, and then, because that general's father was too powerful and too far away to be arrested safely, ordered him killed as well. Without trial, without accusation delivered in person, without any of the legal or ceremonial framework that Macedonian military culture used to manage the relationship between a king and his officers, by messenger. The story begins with Philotas, the son of Parmenion, who commanded the elite companion cavalry, the most prestigious military unit in Alexander's army. Philotas was accused of having prior knowledge of a plot against Alexander's life and failing to report it. The accusation came from within the army itself, from sources whose motivations the ancient sources do not fully clarify. Philotas was arrested, tried before an assembly of Macedonian soldiers, which was the traditional form for capital proceedings in Macedonian military culture, tortured, and executed. The sources for this are multiple and relatively consistent. Arrian, writing in the 2nd century AD, but drawing on the first-hand accounts of Ptolemy and Aristobulus, who were present, describes the proceedings. Curtius Rufus, whose history of Alexander is more rhetorically elaborate and somewhat less reliable but often more detailed, gives a fuller account of the trial itself. Plutarch addresses it in his Life of Alexander, with characteristic attention to the psychological dimensions of the event. What all three sources agree on is what happened next. Parmenion, Philotas's father, one of the most senior and most trusted commanders in the Macedonian army, a man who had served Philip II before Alexander, and who had been, for the first years of the Persian campaign, effectively Alexander's co-commander, was stationed at Ecbatana, the old Median capital in what is now the city of Hamadan in western Iran. He was there because Alexander had placed him there, in charge of the enormous, accumulated treasury of the Persian Empire that the Macedonians had captured and were using to fund their ongoing campaigns. Parmenion had not been accused of anything. He had not been present at the alleged conspiracy. He had not been named by Philotas during the interrogation, or if he had, the sources are careful not to say so directly. The connection between Parmenion and his son's alleged crime was not legal. It was structural. Parmenion commanded too many soldiers, controlled too much money, and had too much loyalty from too many of Alexander's officers for Alexander to feel safe leaving him alive once Philotas had been executed. A man of Parmenion's standing, learning that his son had been killed on Alexander's orders, with access to a treasury and an army, in a position geographically remote from Alexander's ability to respond quickly, the calculation was not complicated. The risk was not theoretical. Alexander sent 3 officers to Ecbatana with sealed orders. The orders were for Parmenion's subordinates. They were instructions to kill him. Parmenion was found, according to Curtius Rufus, in a garden, reading a letter. The letter was from Alexander. It had arrived at the same time as the officers carrying the sealed orders, and it appears from the account to have been a personal communication written in Alexander's own hand, warm in tone, the kind of letter that a commander sends to a trusted senior officer to maintain the relationship across distance. Parmenion was reading this letter when the men sent to kill him arrived and carried out their orders. What remains unexplained is the content of Alexander's letter. Curtius Rufus notes its existence. He describes Parmenion's expression. As he read it, the old general apparently smiled, or showed some sign of pleasure, before the men reached him. But Curtius does not record what the letter said. Neither does Arrian, neither does Plutarch. In the extensive ancient literature on Alexander, a body of writing that preserves fragments of royal correspondence, records the content of speeches and conversations, and preserves details of remarkable granularity about events that happened 3 centuries before the principal sources were writing. The content of this particular letter is simply absent. One theory suggests the letter was deliberately omitted from Alexander's official records, the ephemerides, or royal diaries, which were maintained throughout the campaign by the royal secretary Eumenes of Cardia, and which formed the basis for much of what the later historians drew on. Eumenes survived Alexander and went on to play a significant role in the wars of succession that followed. He had both the access and the motivation to shape what the ephemerides preserved and what they did not. A letter that Alexander had written to a man he was simultaneously having killed, a letter warm enough to make its recipient smile in his final moments, is precisely the kind of document that a careful custodian of Alexander's legacy might prefer to leave unrecorded. Another theory, less focused on deliberate concealment, suggests that the letter simply did not survive the chain of transmission that connected the events at Ecbatana to the historians who later wrote about them. Letters were not preserved. The ephemerides themselves survive only in fragments and references. The absence of the letter's content may be nothing more than the ordinary attrition of ancient documentation, but the timing is difficult to set aside. The letter arrived at the same moment as the men carrying Parmenion's death warrant. That coordination required planning. Someone, Alexander, or the people managing the logistics of the operation, arranged for the personal letter and the sealed orders to travel together, to arrive together, to be presented to Parmenion at the same moment. The letter was not incidental to the operation. It was part of it. What it said, and what Alexander intended it to do, whether it was meant to keep Parmenion calm, to give him a moment of genuine connection before the end, to serve as a kind of apology that could never be spoken aloud, or to function as something more coldly tactical, is a question that the historical record raises and then refuses to answer. Archaeologists have noted, and historians of the Macedonian period have extensively documented that the execution of Parmenion produced a visible change in the structure of Alexander's command. After Ecbatana, Alexander never again appointed a single officer to the level of authority that Parmenion had held. The role was distributed. Responsibilities that had been concentrated in one man were divided among several, none of whom accumulated the combination of military command, financial control, and personal loyalty networks that Parmenion had represented. One theory suggests this restructuring was a direct response to the lesson Alexander took from the Parmenion problem, that the concentration of power in a subordinate created a vulnerability that, once recognized, could only be resolved through an act that damaged the social fabric of the army irreparably, and that the only way to prevent needing to do it again was to ensure the conditions for it never arose again. The Macedonian officer class understood what had happened. The ancient sources are consistent on this point. The execution of Parmenion, and especially the manner of it, without trial, by sealed order, while the man was reading a friendly letter, produced a shift in the relationship between Alexander and his senior commanders that no subsequent victory fully repaired. The army continued to function. It continued to win. It marched all the way to the borders of India, but something in the internal culture of that army, the trust between a king and the men who had followed him from Macedonia, changed at Ecbatana in 330 BC and did not change back. Alexander reportedly wept at Parmenion's death. Multiple sources record this, or record rumors of it. Whether the weeping was genuine grief, political performance, or something that contained elements of both is the kind of question that ancient biography raises without being able to answer. What is clear is that he ordered it done, watched it be done at a distance, and then continued east. The campaign did not pause, the letters did not stop being written, the army did not stop marching, and the punishment he had invented, the preemptive killing of an uncondemned man by sealed order to neutralize a structural threat, was never used again. Not by Alexander, not in quite that form, by any of the successors who divided his empire after his death at 32. It was used once, the man reading the letter smiled, and then it was over, and the thing Alexander had done settled into the historical record, the way that irreversible things do, not as an event that changed direction, but as a line that simply marks the place where the territory on one side ends and the territory on the other side begins. We move now to an empire that tried to solve the problem. Alexander faced the problem of power, concentrated in family members who might become rivals by making the solution into law. The Ottoman Empire, the fratricide code, and the one execution that broke the pattern not by violating the law, but by using something far more dangerous than law to justify itself. A letter, an accusation, and a son who may have been innocent. There is a law that reads, in its original Ottoman Turkish, with the calm precision of administrative necessity. It was written by Mehmed II, the Sultan who conquered Constantinople in 1453, who ended the Byzantine Empire, who remade the political geography of southeastern Europe and the eastern Mediterranean in a single military campaign. A man of considerable intelligence and considerable ruthlessness, who understood that the thing most likely to destroy the empire he was building was not an external enemy, but an internal one. Specifically, a brother. The Ottoman succession system had no fixed rule of primogeniture. The throne did not automatically pass to the eldest son. It passed to whichever son could take it and hold it. This meant that every time a sultan died, his sons, who had been raised in separate provincial governorships, each with their own administrative experience and their own networks of military and political loyalty, competed for the capital. It was military. It produced civil wars. It produced the deaths of soldiers, the disruption of provinces, the vulnerability of borders at precisely the moment when the empire's attention was divided. Mehmed II's solution was to eliminate the competition before it started. The Kanun, the legal code he issued, contained a provision that later historians would come to call the fratricide law. It stated, in language that Ottoman legal scholars and historians, including those at the Topkapi Palace Museum archives, have studied extensively, that whichever of a sultan's sons came to the throne had not only the right, but the obligation to execute his brothers. The word used in the original is not ambiguous. The law did not suggest. It did not permit. It commanded. And it justified itself with a phrase that is, depending on your perspective, either a masterpiece of political pragmatism or one of the most chilling sentences in the history of legal writing. The deaths of princes, the law stated, is preferable to the disorder of the world. The law worked. By the standards of its own purpose, the prevention of succession wars, it worked with considerable effectiveness for more than a century. Sultans came to power. Brothers died. The empire continued. The borders held. The machinery of Ottoman governance functioned without the interruption of civil conflict that had periodically crippled it before Mehmed's codification. But in 1553, the system produced something it had not been designed to produce. Suleiman, the first known in the Western historical tradition as Suleiman the Magnificent, known in the Ottoman tradition as Suleiman the Lawgiver, the longest reigning sultan in Ottoman history, the ruler under whom the empire reached its maximum territorial extent, ordered the execution of his own son. This was not, on its face, a violation of the fratricide law. Sultans had executed sons before, sons who had rebelled openly, sons who had raised armies and marched on the capital, sons whose challenge to the throne was military and unambiguous. The legal framework accommodated filicide as readily as fratricide when the political necessity was clear enough. What made the execution of Shehzada Mustafa different was that Mustafa had not rebelled. Mustafa was, by the account of nearly every contemporary source, the most capable of Suleiman's sons. He was in his late 30s in 1553, experienced, militarily tested, popular with the Janissaries, respected by the provincial governors, admired by the population of the empire, in a way that was documented not just by Ottoman sources, but by foreign observers, including the Habsburg ambassador Ogier Ghislain de Busbecq, whose letters from Constantinople, preserved in European archives and published as the Turkish letters, provide one of the most detailed and reliable external perspectives on the Ottoman court of this period. Busbecq wrote about Mustafa with unmistakable admiration. He described a prince who combined physical capability with political intelligence, who was regarded by the Ottoman military as a natural successor, who represented, in Busbecq's assessment, the most formidable figure the empire was likely to produce in his generation, and Suleiman had him strangled. The execution took place at the military camp at Ereğli, in what is now the Konya province of modern Turkey. During an active military campaign, Mustafa was summoned to his father's tent. He entered. The mutes, the deaf-mute executioners employed by the Ottoman court specifically because they could not hear or repeat what occurred in royal chambers, were waiting inside. Mustafa was killed before he could speak, or before anything he said could be heard by his father, who was reportedly present on the other side of a curtain. The official justification was treason. Mustafa had allegedly been in secret correspondence with the Safavid Persian Shah, offering to defect or to coordinate a challenge to his father's authority. The evidence for this was a letter, or letters, produced at court before the execution. One theory suggests these letters were forged. The theory is not a modern invention or a retrospective rehabilitation. It was circulating within the Ottoman Empire within years of the execution, and the principal figures named in connection with it were Hürrem Sultan, the woman known in Western sources as Roxolana, Suleiman's legal wife, and the mother of his other sons, and Grand Vizier Rustem Pasha, who was married to Suleiman and Hürrem's daughter, and whose political interests were directly served by the removal of Mustafa from the succession. The logic of the accusation against Hürrem and Rustem is not complicated. Hürrem's sons were younger than Mustafa, and less capable by the assessment of most contemporary observers. As long as Mustafa lived, they were unlikely to inherit. Rustem's position as Grand Vizier was dependent on maintaining favour with the Sultan, and a succession that brought Mustafa to the throne would likely end Rustem's career and possibly his life. Both had clear motivation. Both had access to the mechanisms of court communication through which forged letters could be introduced and authenticated. What remains unexplained is why Suleiman, who was by all accounts an intelligent and experienced ruler who had navigated Ottoman court politics for decades, accepted the evidence without the kind of investigation that the gravity of the accusation should have demanded. Busbecq, writing from his position as a foreign observer with access to court gossip and diplomatic intelligence, noted that the execution produced immediate and visible shock among the Ottoman military, not the disciplined acceptance that would accompany the removal of a genuinely treasonous prince, but something closer to grief, and then to a quiet, dangerous anger. Suleiman appears to have understood, at some point after the execution, what he had done. He wrote a poem. This is documented. Suleiman was a serious poet who wrote under the pen name Muhibi, and his surviving divan, his collected poetry, contains a poem of mourning for Mustafa that is studied by Ottoman literary scholars to this day. The poem does not confess doubt about the verdict. It does not name Hürrem or Rustam, but it mourns with a depth and a specificity that reads, in the assessment of scholars who have worked with the original Ottoman Turkish text, as something beyond conventional royal elegy. It reads like guilt. Archaeologists have noted, and Ottoman historians, including those at the Research Center for Islamic History, Art and Culture in Istanbul, have documented that Suleiman subsequently had Rustem Pasha removed from the Grand Vizierate within months of the execution, before reinstating him later. The removal was temporary, and the reasons given were administrative. But its timing, directly following the execution that Rustem had reportedly facilitated, suggests a connection that the official record declines to make explicit. Hürrem Sultan died in 1558, 5 years after Mustafa. She never faced any formal accounting for her alleged role, whether she was responsible, whether Rustem acted alone or in concert with her, whether both were simply responding to genuine intelligence about Mustafa's intentions that has not survived in the sources. None of this has been resolved. What the historical record establishes is this: Suleiman broke the fratricide system not by violating it, but by extending it to a son who had not done what the system was designed to address. The fratricide law existed to prevent succession wars. Mustafa had not started a succession war. He had, at most, been accused of planning to start one on the basis of evidence whose authenticity was immediately questioned by people in a position to evaluate it. The execution worked in the narrow sense that Mustafa never became sultan. It failed in every other sense. The son who did eventually succeed, Suleiman Selim II, Hürrem's son, known to history as Selim the Drunkard, is regarded by Ottoman historians as among the weakest sultans of the empire's classical period. The Janissaries who had admired Mustafa never transferred that admiration to his successors. Something in the relationship between the Ottoman military and the Ottoman throne shifted after 1553 in a way that the empire spent the next century trying, with limited success, to manage. One theory suggests that Suleiman understood all of this before the end of his life, and that the poem mourning Mustafa was not simply a father's grief, but a ruler's recognition that he had solved a small problem by creating a large one, that in removing the heir the empire wanted, he had guaranteed the heir the empire got. He outlived Mustafa by 13 years. He died on campaign in 1566, at the age of 71, still moving, still fighting, still building the empire that the son he had killed might have sustained better than the sons who survived him. The poem for Mustafa is still read. The letters that justified the execution have never been found. We have now travelled through 8 empires and 8 punishments. What we have not yet asked is the question that sits underneath all of them, the question of what these 8 cases, separated by centuries and continents and entirely different systems of power, have in common. The answer is not what you might expect, and it changes what all of them mean. We have now visited 8 empires. We have stood at the edge of a sealed underground chamber in Rome and watched a lamp burn in the dark. We have floated, conceptually, on a stagnant Persian marsh and asked whether the boats were ever real. We have traced chisel marks on a wall in Amarna where the workers stopped and did not come back. We have looked at photographs taken in Beijing in 1905 that a French philosopher spent the rest of his career trying to understand. We have followed molten silver into the darkness of a city siege in Kazakhstan. We have stood at the top of a pyramid in Mexico for 4 days and counted. We have read a letter whose contents no one recorded. We have looked for forged correspondence in an Ottoman archive and found only the absence of it. 8 empires, 8 punishments. And now it is time to ask the question that the individual stories, taken separately, do not quite force you to ask. The question that only becomes visible when you step back far enough to see all 8 of them at the same time. Why did every one of these empires stop? Not why did they stop in the sense of what external pressure or legal reform caused the practice to be abolished. Several of these punishments were never formally abolished. They were not banned. They were not condemned by a successor ruler. They were not the subject of a public reckoning or an official change of policy. They simply were not repeated. The empire that invented each one walked away from it without explanation, without ceremony, without leaving any record of a decision having been made. That pattern across 8 civilizations, across more than 15 centuries of human history, across cultures with no meaningful contact with each other and no shared legal or philosophical tradition, is not a coincidence. Coincidences do not organize themselves this neatly across this much distance. Something else is happening here. The first thing all 8 cases share is what might be called the problem of the witness. Every one of these punishments was, in some sense, too visible. The burial of the Vestal was witnessed by the entire city of Rome, the sealed litter, the procession, the filling of the earth, the return to ordinary life above a chamber where someone was still alive. The dedication ceremony at Tenochtitlan was witnessed by dignitaries from across Mesoamerica, including the empire's enemies. The execution of Parmenion was witnessed by an army that had followed its general from Macedonia and understood exactly what the sealed orders meant. The strangling of Mustafa was witnessed by Janissaries who had wanted him to be their next commander. In every case, the punishment was designed to send a message. And in every case, the message that was received was not quite the message that was intended. Rome intended the burial of the Vestal to communicate the absolute sanctity of religious law and the total authority of the state to enforce it. What the army of witnesses appears to have taken from it, based on the subsequent literary record, was something more ambiguous, a discomfort, a residue, a sense that the city had done something to itself that it could not fully account for within its own moral framework. Ahoitzotl intended the ceremony at Tenochtitlan to communicate the limitless power of the Aztec state. What it communicated to the priests who stopped participating and to the subject peoples who attended as witnesses was the possibility that the state had exceeded its own theological mandate, that there was a limit and the limit had been crossed, and that crossing it changed the nature of the thing doing the crossing. Alexander intended the execution of Parmenion to communicate that no concentration of power within his command structure would be tolerated. What it communicated to his officer class was that personal loyalty and decades of service provided no protection against a political calculation, and that the social contract between a Macedonian king and his commanders had been unilaterally revised in a way that could not be unrevised. Archaeologists have noted, across multiple civilizational contexts, that the most extreme acts of state power tend to leave anomalous traces in the archaeological and documentary record, not more evidence than comparable acts, but less. The deliberate underrepresentation of extreme events in official records is a pattern that appears consistently enough across unconnected cultures that it suggests a near universal administrative instinct. The thing that went too far should not be commemorated, because commemoration is a form of repetition, and repetition is the one outcome the people responsible are most determined to avoid. One theory suggests that what these 8 empires were responding to, in their silence and their restraint, was a specific kind of institutional self-knowledge. Every one of these civilizations had developed, through centuries of practice, a set of norms around the use of state power, norms that were partly legal, partly religious, partly cultural, and partly the accumulated understanding of what kinds of violence the population and the administrative class could absorb without destabilizing the system that produced the violence in the first place. These punishments, in each case, exceeded those norms, and the excess was recognized not necessarily immediately, not necessarily consciously, but recognized in the behavioral record that followed. The empires did not stop because they became more humane. Several of them continued to practice extreme violence in other forms for centuries after the singular event we have examined. Rome kept executing people. The Qing kept using lynching. The Ottomans kept killing brothers and sons. The recognition that something had gone too far in a specific instance did not produce a general reformation of practice. What it produced was something more precise and more interesting, a boundary, a specific, unspoken, never formally articulated line that the institution would not cross again in that particular way. The punishment that was used once became, through its singularity, a marker of the edge of what was permissible, not because anyone declared it impermissible, but because the act of crossing that edge once had made the location of the edge visible in a way it had not been before. What remains unexplained is how that knowledge was transmitted. None of these empires left a document saying, "This is the thing we will not do again." No Roman senator recorded a vote to prohibit the living burial of Vestals. it simply became extraordinarily rare. No Ottoman legal scholar annotated the fratricide code to add a provision about the quality of evidence required. No Aztec ruler issued a decree limiting the scale of dedication ceremonies. The restraint was real, and it was consistent, and it was maintained across multiple successions in each case. But the mechanism by which it was transmitted from one generation of rulers to the next is not visible in the surviving record. One theory suggests the transmission was cultural rather than documentary, that the memory of the singular event was carried in the oral traditions of the administrative and priestly classes, in the training of officials and the socialization of rulers, in the stories that were told about what had happened and what had followed, stories that did not need to be written down to be effective, because the people who needed to hear them heard them in the course of becoming the people who would make these decisions. Another theory suggests the transmission was architectural. The Campus Sceleratus remained a named location in Rome for centuries after the last burial. Amana remained a visible ruin whose condition advertised what had been done to it. The Templo Mayor remained the center of Tenochtitlan, its offering deposits sealed in its foundations, its scale a permanent record of what one ruler had done there and no successor had attempted to match. The physical landscape of these empires encoded the memory that the documentary record suppressed. The buildings remembered what the documents forgot. There is a third element, shared by all 8 cases, that is perhaps the most significant and the least examined. In every instance, the punishment was directed, at least in part, at someone who held a position of exceptional proximity to power. The Vestal was not an ordinary Roman woman, she was one of the most sacred figures in the state religion. Parmenion was not an ordinary general, he was the second most powerful man in the Macedonian army. Mustafa was not an ordinary Ottoman prince, he was the most capable heir to the largest empire in the world. Even Inalchuk, whose crime triggered the Mongol invasion, was not an ordinary border official. He was a governor, acting, possibly, on the orders of a king. The punishments invented for these people were not drawn from the standard repertoire of state violence because the standard repertoire was insufficient. These were not ordinary criminals requiring ordinary punishment. They were people whose relationship to power made them simultaneously essential and dangerous, whose proximity to the center of the system made conventional judicial process inadequate, either because the law did not reach them or because the law's reach in their case created more problems than it solved. Archaeologists have noted that the material evidence associated with these punishments, the chambers, the offering deposits, the erasure marks, the documented absences in administrative archives, tends to cluster at the highest levels of the social and political hierarchy. These were not punishments invented for the periphery of power. They were invented at the center, for people who lived at the center, by people who shared that center and understood its specific vulnerabilities from the inside. This is what the hidden thread connects. Not cruelty, not cultural difference, not the particular psychology of individual rulers, though individual psychology plays its role in each story. What connects these 8 punishments is the problem of power encountering its own limits, the moment when the system designed to project and maintain authority arrives at a situation that the system's own rules cannot adequately address and invents something new to fill the gap. The invention is singular because the gap only needs to be filled once. Once the boundary has been marked, its location is known. Once the limit has been found, it does not need to be found again. Every one of these empires believed, in some register of its institutional self-understanding, that it was absolute, that its authority had no ceiling, that the reach of its power extended as far as it needed to extend. And every one of these empires, in a single documented moment, discovered that this was not true, that there was a cost to the exercise of extreme power that the exercise itself could not absorb, a remainder left over after the punishment was complete, that the empire then carried forward, silently, into everything that came after. The punishments were singular, the remainder was permanent. We turn now to the physical evidence, the specific archaeological objects and documentary fragments that anchor these stories in the material world. A lamp in a Roman chamber, a deposit in a Mexican pyramid, a letter that no surviving source records. 3 pieces of evidence that the historical record preserves incompletely, and what the incompleteness tells us about the limits of what we can know. There is a difference between a historical mystery and a gap in the record. A gap in the record is ordinary. Documents are lost, archives burn, clay tablets dissolve. The normal entropy of time removes evidence at a rate that historians have learned to accept as the baseline condition of their discipline. You work with what survives, and you acknowledge what does not. A historical mystery is something else. It is a gap that has a shape, a specific, bounded absence, whose edges are defined clearly enough that you can see exactly what is missing and ask precisely why it is not there. The three pieces of evidence we are going to examine now are not gaps. They are mysteries. Each one is attached to a real location, a real researcher, a real institutional archive. Each one has been examined by people with the training and the tools to examine it carefully, and each one remains, after that examination, unexplained in a way that the examination itself makes more rather than less apparent. We begin in Rome. In 1876, Rodolfo Lanciani was conducting systematic archaeological surveys of the area near the Colline Gate, the region the ancient sources identified as the Campus Sceleratus, the site of the Vestal burials. Lanciani was not a fringe figure. He is one of the foundational scholars of Roman topography, the author of the Forma Urbis Romae, a monumental archaeological map of ancient Rome that remains a standard reference in the field. His work is held at the British School at Rome and continues to be cited by researchers working on Roman urban archaeology today. In his published notes from the 1876 survey, Lanciani described the discovery of what appeared to be a small underground chamber in the area, consistent with the ancient descriptions of the burial site. The chamber was not fully excavated. The constraints of the survey and the urban development of the area above it made complete excavation impractical. But Lanciani recorded what the partial investigation revealed. Among the contents he described was evidence consistent with a small oil lamp. Not the lamp itself, the physical object had not survived intact across 2,000 years of burial, but the residue, the physical trace of something that had burned in that space, in a position consistent with deliberate placement rather than accidental deposit. Archaeologists have noted that this detail does not fit neatly into either of the two standard interpretations of the Vestal burial. If the chamber was a legal fiction, a way of technically avoiding execution while ensuring death, the lamp serves no functional purpose and its presence requires explanation. If the chamber was a genuine ritual space, something between punishment and sacred passage, the lamp makes theological sense but raises questions about the nature of the sentence that Roman legal sources do not address. What remains unexplained is why Lanciani's report, which was published and is part of the documented record of Roman archaeology, has received so little sustained attention in the scholarship on Vestal punishment. The chamber is mentioned in passing in several standard treatments of the subject. The lamp detail is noted and then moved past. No subsequent excavation of the site has been conducted with the specific aim of investigating Lanciani's findings. The ground above the Campus Sceleratus is now built over in ways that make large-scale excavation practically difficult, but the absence of focused scholarly attention to what Lanciani found is itself a small, specific mystery sitting inside the larger one. We move to Mexico City. In 2015, researchers from the Instituto Nacional de Antropología y Historia INA, the Mexican federal institution responsible for the ongoing excavation and study of the Templo Maya site, catalogued a deposit designated Offering 141. The Templo Maya excavations have been producing offering deposits since 1978, and the cataloguing and analysis of these deposits is ongoing, systematic, and conducted to the standards of contemporary archaeological practice. Offering 141 contained human remains. This is not unusual for the Templo Maya deposits. Human remains appear in multiple offering caches associated with the site. What distinguished Offering 141 was the arrangement of those remains. The individuals in the deposit were placed in orientations that the excavating team described in their published catalogue notes as inconsistent with the standard ceremonial patterns documented in the surviving Aztec sources and in the broader corpus of Templo Maya offering deposits. The positioning did not correspond to any known ritual configuration. It was not random. The arrangement showed deliberate placement, but the deliberate placement did not follow the template. One theory suggests that Offering 141 represents a moment of improvisation within the 1487 ceremony. a response to something that happened during the 4 days that required an unplanned, ritual action, a deviation from the prescribed sequence that the priests conducting the ceremony invented on the spot, and that was never documented in the sources that survived the conquest. What remains unexplained is whether the deviation was theological or logistical, whether something happened during the ceremony that required a ritual response outside the standard framework, or whether the sheer scale of the event produced practical problems that the prescribed ceremony had no procedure for managing, and that the priests resolved as best they could in the moment. The deposit continues to be analysed. The full publication of the findings from offering 141 has not yet appeared in the scholarly literature as of the time this documentary was produced. What has been published is sufficient to establish that the deposit is anomalous. What it means remains an open question that the researchers responsible for it are still working to answer. We turn finally to the letters. Curtius Rufus, writing his history of Alexander in the 1st century AD, refers to a letter that Alexander sent to Parmenion at Ecbatana, a personal communication that arrived simultaneously with the sealed orders for Parmenion's execution. The letter is described, its effect on its recipient is described. Its contents are not. Researchers working with the Alexander sources, including scholars at institutions such as the University of Oxford's Faculty of Classics, where the study of the ancient Alexander tradition has produced some of the most rigorous scholarship in the field, have noted that the absence of the letter's content in Curtius is not matched by an absence of other personal communications in the same text. Curtius preserves fragments of Alexander's correspondence elsewhere. He quotes letters. He summarizes their contents. The selective silence around this particular letter is not consistent with a general policy of omitting correspondence. One theory suggests the omission traces back to the Ephemerides, the royal diary maintained by Eumenes of Cardia, and that the letter was removed from that source before the historians who relied on it were writing. Another theory suggests Curtius had access to the letter's content and made a deliberate authorial decision not to include it, either because it was too damaging to Alexander's reputation or because its content was so ambiguous that including it would raise more questions than it resolved. What remains unexplained is the smile. Curtius records that Parmenion, reading Alexander's letter in the garden at Ecbatana, showed an expression of pleasure before the men sent to kill him arrived. That detail is specific enough to suggest it came from a source with genuine proximity to the event. An eyewitness account, a report filed by one of the officers present, something that found its way into the documentary chain that eventually reached Curtius. Someone was there. Someone saw the expression on an old general's face as he read a letter from the man who was having him killed. Someone thought it was worth recording. And then the letter itself, the thing that produced the expression, disappeared from every surviving source as completely as if it had never been written. The lamp burned in the sealed chamber. The bones in offering 141 were placed in a pattern no one has yet explained. The old general smiled at words we will never read. 3 objects. 3 absences. 3 places where the record is not simply incomplete, but shaped where the missing thing has a contour precise enough that you can feel the edge of it, even in the dark. There is a question that historians almost never ask directly, because it sits at the edge of what historical methodology is designed to handle. Not what happened, not why it happened, but what it means that we are still here, asking about it. The punishments we have examined in this documentary are not historical curiosities. They are not footnotes. They are, in each case, moments where a civilization arrived at the outer boundary of what its own system of power could sustain, and the trace they left behind is still shaping the world we live in ways that are more direct and more specific than the comfortable distance of ancient history usually implies. Consider the legal framework that emerged from the ruins of the Second World War. The Nuremberg trials of 1945 and 1946 represented the first systematic attempt by an international body to hold individual state actors accountable for crimes committed under the authority of a state. The legal scholars who constructed the framework for those trials, working under enormous time pressure, without a clear precedent in modern international law, reached back into the ancient world for their foundational concepts. The Roman legal tradition, including the Roman understanding of crimes against the sacred order, informed the category of crimes against humanity in ways that legal historians at institutions, including Harvard Law School, have documented in detail. The idea that certain acts exceed the authority of any state to sanction, that there is a category of actions so extreme that no legal framework can legitimize it, has Roman jurisprudence as one of its deepest roots. The Vestal and the war criminal are connected by a thread that runs through 2,000 years of legal thought. The United Nations Convention Against Torture, adopted in 1984 and now ratified by more than 170 countries, was drafted with explicit reference to historical practices, including those documented in Chinese and Ottoman judicial history. The drafting committee's working documents, available through the UN archives, reference the history of judicially sanctioned torture as the evidentiary basis for the Convention's core argument that the capacity for extreme cruelty is not a cultural aberration, but a structural vulnerability present in any system of organized power, requiring institutional constraint rather than cultural confidence to prevent. The Qing magistrate who exceeded the prescribed limit of lingqi and was executed for it, the case whose record was removed from the imperial annals, is, in a specific and documentable sense, one of the ancestors of the legal principle that an executioner who exceeds a lawful sentence has committed a crime. That principle is now embedded in the legal systems of most of the world's democracies. The case that established it most clearly in the Chinese historical record was the one that was deliberately erased. The erasure did not erase the principle, it transmitted it. Classicist Paul Cartledge, whose work on ancient Greek concepts of justice has been central to the field for decades, has argued that the most important contribution of Greek and Macedonian political thought to modern governance is not the concept of democracy, which the ancient Athenians practiced in a form so different from its modern descendants that the continuity is more rhetorical than structural, but the concept of the limit of legitimate authority, the idea that power has a boundary, that crossing the boundary transforms the exercise of power into something that undermines the authority it was meant to express, is visible in the Macedonian officer corps' response to the execution of Parmenion as clearly as it is visible in any philosophical text. Alexander's army kept marching, but it marched differently after Ecbatana. And the difference matters, not as a historical detail, but as a case study in what happens to an institution when it discovers, through a single irreversible act, that the social contract holding it together has a load-bearing assumption that the institution itself has just removed. Modern organizational theory has a name for this. It calls it a trust threshold event. The academic literature on institutional collapse and organizational dysfunction returns, repeatedly, to the same finding. The events that most reliably damage an institution's long-term functioning are not the ones that are most visible or most immediately costly, but the ones that alter the internal understanding of what the institution will and will not do. Once that understanding shifts, it shifts permanently, and no subsequent act of reassurance or reform fully returns the institution to its prior state. Alexander's officers knew this in 330 BC, without having the vocabulary to describe it. Suleiman's Janissaries knew it in 1553. The Aztec priests who set down their instruments on the second day of the Tenochtitlan ceremony knew it. They did not have institutional theory. They had something older and more reliable, the direct experience of an organization discovering its own limits from the inside. What these 8 empires left behind, then, is not simply a collection of extreme punishments. It is a collection of limit events, moments where power, operating at its outer edge, produced information about itself that it could not absorb and could not fully suppress. The information leaked. It leaked into the archaeological record, into the documentary silences, into the behavioral changes of the institutions involved, into the legal and philosophical traditions that inherited the questions these empires raised without answering. And it leaked into the stories that people kept telling, across centuries and across the dissolution of the empires themselves, about what had happened at the edge. Every one of these empires believed it was building something eternal. The Romans expected Rome to last forever. Their literature says so. Their architecture says so. Their legal system was designed with a permanence in mind that assumed the institution would outlast any individual act committed within it. The Aztecs built the Templo Mayor to the scale of the cosmos. The Ottomans codified their succession law as if the problems it solved were the permanent problems of a permanent institution. The Mongols moved across the world with the confidence of people who believed the world had been given to them. None of them are here. What remains is the evidence of what they did at their limits. The lamp in the sealed chamber. The bones arranged in a pattern no one has explained. The poem a sultan wrote for the son he had killed on the basis of letters that were never found. These are not relics of cruelty. They are relics of the moment when power looked at itself clearly, recognized something it could not accept, and chose silence over reckoning. The question is not what that says about them. The question is what the fact that we are still here, still asking, still looking at the evidence they tried to bury, what that says about us. If this documentary left you with more questions than it answered, that is not an accident. That is what the historical record actually looks like when you get close enough to it. The 8 empires we examine tonight each left behind a silence where a record should be. And those silences, it turns out, are some of the most informative things the ancient world preserved. The next documentary in this series goes further. We examine the punishments that were not used once, but thousands of times, the ones so normalized within their systems that they disappeared from the historical record, not through deliberate erasure but through sheer repetition. And we follow the work of one archaeologist whose findings, published quietly in a peer-reviewed journal and largely ignored by mainstream historical media, demonstrated that the physical evidence of these punishments tells a story measurably different from, and in several cases, directly contradicting what the official records of those same empires claimed was happening. The gap between what was recorded and what was done is wider than most people realize. If that is the kind of history that keeps you up at night, or, perhaps more accurately, the kind that settles you into something ancient and worth thinking about, slowly subscribe. And stay close,